After 13 videos now longer than the entire movie itself, we're finally halfway through what the Holy Kingdom movie was supposed to cover. Volume 12 ended with Ainz's confirmation that no one needed to be spared in the upcoming siege, and Volume 13 starts us off with an introduction to these demi-humans. What's more important beyond that though is the heartfelt moment shared between Ainz and Neia. It's a scene that has so much more meaning once you know all the context behind it. So, whether you want to know the lore behind the strongest demi-humans in Demiurge's army, or see the moment Ainz offered Neia safe haven in his own nation, be sure to stick around for all that cut content. Before we dive deeper into the story though, this video is sponsored by Bleach Soul Resonance, the brand new mobile game where you'll get to experience a true-to-heart adaptation of Bleach all over again. It's here you'll dive into its immersive story where every fight, scene, and even the lines have been crafted with genuine passion and care. What stuck out to me the most though was the innovative blade clashing gameplay different for each of the Soul Reapers. Every Zanpakuto hits with their own unique style, making every swing and every clash with them feel alive. You'll know what I mean once you unleash your first Bankai. The seamless character switching also makes crafting combos all the more fun too, since you can chain together various skills with whatever lineup you choose to fight with. Want to recreate the iconic duo of Ichigo and Rukia? How about the fan favorites of Byakuya and Yoruichi? All are obtainable to fight side by side with. So, with the whole squad to chain attacks with mid-battle, you can easily make every fight feel like a perfectly choreographed battle straight out of the anime. It's all part of what makes this one of the most faithful anime-to-game experiences out there. Just click the link below to get started today. Plus, with an 80 draw guarantee, you're bound to get your favorite characters. So download Bleach Soul Resonance and wield the blade of your soul. Part 14. The Calm Before the Storm. Here we have a convening between the strongest leaders of the demi-humans, a select group chosen based on their power and influence. The focus starts off on him, a Zoostia currently angered by the fact their army hasn't attacked yet. He was livid to the point that rage couldn't even begin to describe his anger. Still, there was nothing he could do about it, as him and everyone else were under the control of the overwhelmingly powerful demon Yaldabaoth, the entity bringing all the demi-humans together and the one partitioning them into the groups we see now. 40,000 were deployed against the Holy Kingdom's southern army, 50,000 defending the prison camps in the already seized territories, and another 10,000 performing odd jobs like scouting the north for potential supply stashes. He and the other Zoostias were part of the force numbering 40,000, forming a detachment from the prison camp group. As determined as they were to fight though, orders had left them stagnant for days now. It was a state that left him discontent enough to express it with the other demi-human leaders. So, within this tent were some of the most powerful members of the entire demi-human army, including him as he too was in the top 10. It's for this reason he was one of their peers, but he couldn't command them like how he did with his own tribe. No, that position fell to the most powerful demi-human amongst all of them. A Nagaraja that went by the name Rokesh, more commonly referred to by his nickname Rainbow Scales. These shining scales were more than just flashy though, as in addition to being as hard as a dragon's, they were also incredibly resistant to magic. Combine that with the enchanted armor he wore over them, and it was no wonder he was regarded as one of the most formidable inhabitants in the entire region. So it should come as no surprise that he was also named the Commander-in-Chief, a position given to him by the demonic emperor himself. He does also wield a famous weapon called the Trident of Dehydration, but whatever terrifying special ability it's supposed to possess, I don't think we saw it in the movies. In any case, it's here the Zoostia would ask why it was they weren't attacking. That much we saw in the movie, but what we didn't see was the reason for all this eagerness. You see, Vijar here had just inherited the title of Vicious Claw, a generational name known amongst all the demi-humans. As the most recent successor though, he didn't believe that he was worthy of it yet, at least not until he could prove himself. So, this battle here was the perfect opportunity to do so, since with an enemy strong enough to defeat Buzza residing in the city, what better way to prove yourself than to take them down? Vijar envisioned himself fighting against what he assumed was the Holy Knight who wielded a sword of light. That's when the Megaros would chime in to mock Vijar, leading to the quarrel which almost led to a fight. The details of that aren't particularly important, but what is are the unique characteristics of some of the other leaders. The primate Stone Eater was known for its ability to inherit the traits of whatever gems were included in its diet, so say it ate a diamond, then that would allow it to temporarily gain physical resistance. For most Stone Eaters, the max traits they could hold were 3 at once, but for this one in particular, he could possess far more. So he amongst his tribe was considered different. As for the Orthrus general decked out in armor, he was best known for emerging victorious despite being outnumbered 10 to 1. Vijar knew he could beat him one-on-one, but to compare martial prowess to someone of such prestige was ridiculous. There was no one who held a better advantage when it came to leading than him. Finally came the other Zoastia alongside Vijar, a ranger who was better known as Black Iron. Rangers weren't common amongst their people who typically relied on brute force, but for him, his skills as an assassin were unmatched. If given a target, his iron will wouldn't falter until they were dead, hence the name Black Iron. So, those were the powerhouses within the demi-human army, all kept at bay by a single order from Yaldabaoth. Yaldabaoth didn't specify how many days they needed to give the demi-humans, so in order to mitigate any risk to the stability they possessed now, the leaders decided 2 more days were necessary. They did, after all, have to watch over quite a large number of prisoners, so despite there being 10,000 of them, any coordinated effort from the greater number of prisoners could prove troublesome. Some of the demi-humans suggested eating the prisoners right in front of the city, but not many demi-humans actually enjoyed eating humans. They also figured that might cause a bit too much despair for the humans. Like, if they pushed them to the point where they'd already resigned themselves to die, then that to the demi-humans was no fun to fight against. So, in the end, the plan of attack was a multi-sided offensive of sorts. One where everyone on the west gate was allowed to be massacred, while those at the east gate needed to be chased off so survivors could escape. Smaller detachments were to handle the north and south walls, a force strong enough to do decent damage, preferably at range just to add pressure from all angles. Everyone else was to focus on the west gate, making that the most concentrated point of conflict. So that's how things were going for the demi-humans. It's in classic Overlord fashion, though, that these demi-humans are built up just to be squashed by Ainz later. Their plans and motivations are insignificant in the face of the grand scheme Demiurge set up for them. Switching things back to Ainz and Neia now, it was prior to this scene here that Neia would first have a moment to herself. She was headed to Ainz's room, but before entering, she first needed to overcome the sickening taste erupting from the pits of her stomach. Why, might you ask, was Neia feeling nauseous? Well, that was because she had just witnessed one of the most gruesome acts of torture ever. You see, it had been 3 days since the city had come under the Liberation Army's control, and to their surprise, the demi-humans hadn't made a move yet. They didn't even come to try and negotiate. It was on this 3rd day that things were different, as seemingly out of nowhere, a group of demi-humans would emerge with about 20 or so Holy Kingdom prisoners. They would approach close enough for any skilled archer to easily hit them, but unfortunately for the paladins, no one that well trained was amongst them. So, out of fear of hitting the prisoners or triggering a battle of 40,000 versus 10,000, all the defenders on the wall could do was watch. They were witness to a mix of prisoners ranging from men and women to even children. There weren't, however, any elderly, and all present were stripped completely naked. Now, everyone watching assumed this was the demi-humans come to make a bargain, but rather than say anything, they instead spoke with their actions. They would casually rip the throats out of each of the prisoners, then hold their bodies upside down so everyone could see their blood flow into the dirt. It was after that the demi-humans would begin to dismember them, butchering them in a way you wouldn't even do to an animal. For Neia, she had seen her father dismember animals many a time before, but to see it done to humans was shocking to say the least. That wasn't even the worst of it though, as the demi-humans would then proceed with the most grotesque part yet. They would devour what remained while the meat was still fresh. The whole thing was disgustingly terrifying, especially since some of the prisoners weren't even dead yet. So the shrieks of the infant whose stomach was getting ripped apart echoed endlessly. They were joined by a choir of wails for all those who were getting their innards yanked out. Fortunately, such an act wasn't enough to trigger a response, as the only person who would have done anything was left behind with Caspond. Had she been here instead of Gustav, then the battle would have broken out for sure. So that's what Neia was dealing with before, making it a struggle to compose herself before arriving at Ainz's room here. For Ainz, he was looking at the commotion happening outside his window far more than any he'd seen in the past. He assumed it was preparations for the demi-humans who were finally making their move to attack. The reason he could only guess, though, was because for the past 4 days, Ainz had spent all his time here. He wanted to emphasize that he wasn't going to participate in this fight. So, that meant not even attending the war meetings, an act the leadership of the Liberation Army wasn't too thrilled about. As much as they wanted to contest it, though, they knew they couldn't, as having a foreign king fight on their behalf wasn't the best look for them. No, the best they could do was share information with him through Neia, a message they could only hope would be received with welcome. It was this time that Neia would share the fact the demi-humans just performed a demonstration of sorts, news that would lead Ainz to assume a showdown was imminent. To him, the demonstration was clearly a means to damage the morale, an obvious precursor to an oncoming siege. This then led Ainz to ask if Neia thought she could win, a question to which she wanted to immediately answer with no. I mean, the outcome was obvious to pretty much everyone. Not only were they outnumbered 4-1, but the 10,000 troops they claimed to have also included the elderly and children. Combine that with the fact not everyone had physically and mentally recovered from their time in the prison camps, and the actual number of those capable of fighting was far lower. So, despite the advantage typically going to the defenders in a siege-type situation, that advantage didn't apply when both sides weren't evenly matched to begin with. You couldn't compare the innately stronger demi-humans to the ordinary run-of-the-mill humans. That being the case, the only ones who could actually put up a fight were the paladins, priests, and career soldiers. Everyone else would just end up being cannon fodder. That's not to say winning wasn't entirely impossible, as in the case there weren't any extraordinary demi-humans amongst the ranks of the 40,000, then a paladin like Remedios could probably take on all of them. So long as she was immediately healed whenever wounded or reaching her fatigue limit, it was more than possible for her to take on 40,000 basic demi-humans all by herself. That, however, was only if the demi-humans didn't have anyone as strong as her, a case in which it was best to assume that there was at least one. Since Buzza had ruled the town previously, it was likely at least one Buzza-level enemy had come to take his place, an opponent Neia knew she'd never win against no matter how hard she tried. Ainz had made such a fight look easy, but who's to say the next demi-human leader wasn't stronger than Buzza? So, as capable as Remedios was, at the end of the day, fatigue was going to be her worst enemy. No matter how many times magic was used to recover it, a recurring problem such as this would only make room for any of the numerous demi-humans to jump in and take advantage. Such was the threat that came with such overwhelming numbers. Of course, absolute power would always trump that, and standing in front of her now was a being who embodied it. The Overlord and Sorcerer King that was Ainz Ulgon. He realistically was the only hope any of the Liberation Army had in surviving all this. It was with that in mind that Neia would finally answer Ainz's question, saying how she wasn't sure if they could win. All she could say was how they'd try their best. Ainz didn't really seem too concerned with their dire situation, but he was curious on whether Yaldabaoth had showed up yet. Reason being that unless he showed up, it was hard to justify getting involved. With all the mana he'd spent just a few days ago, Ainz made it sound like he was still recovering. He wanted everyone to know he was in a weakened state of sorts. As clear as that was to those in the Liberation Army, though, they had still attempted to get him involved by feeding him false information. It was at one of the meetings that Neia was told someone spotted a demon that looked like Yaldabaoth, but when Neia mentioned how she'd go to confirm that herself, she was quickly told how it was probably a mistake. It was a peculiar sequence of events that made it clear the War Council was desperate to get Ainz involved any way they could. Such deception left Neia upset, since despite their dire situation, she felt they still needed to respect Ainz for the king he was. And to her, fooling him was certainly no way to do that. That still didn't change the fact things weren't looking good, and after having heard how the demi-humans were moving, it was clear now that a siege was inevitable. The only good part being that meant they wouldn't be starved to death. Still, that meant they were surrounded on all sides now, so their odds only went from overwhelmingly bad to fairly bad. And even if they did manage to fend off this initial assault, there was no reason to think the demi-humans wouldn't just switch to starvation tactics after. So, in a way, Ainz was essentially saying that there was no path to victory. He knew a defensive hold like this was only effective if reinforcements were coming, but with that dependent on a very unlikely sequence of events, this to him could very well just be checkmate. That being the case, Ainz would generously offer safe transportation to a few dozen people with his magic, but with the decision of who resting upon Neia, that was a burden she decided to do without. She couldn't even bring herself to suggest caste spawn, since it would be nothing less than shameful to have their current king retreat while a foreign one fought on their behalf. It was then that Ainz would finally turn to face Neia, offering her a privilege not many are given. You see, to Ainz, Neia was nothing but a victim of the foolishness of her supervisors. It didn't matter how skilled she was, as there was nothing a single squire could do to overcome the mistakes handed down to her. So, whether out of compassion or a lingering sense of camaraderie, Ainz would ask if Neia wanted to join his own nation. If what she truly wanted was to become a paladin, then Ainz had no problem having her develop her skills as a paladin of the Sorcerer Kingdom. It was an offer that, as you'd expect, left Neia deeply moved, but surprisingly wasn't enough for her to say yes to. As much as she wanted to, the thought of what she'd lose if she did made her tremble in fear. I mean, this was after all the same kingdom both her parents had died for. It was the same kingdom that housed the hometown she loved growing up in. To think there was a future where she may never be able to return to the country of her ancestors, well, that was a future she didn't want to live in. The most important factor leading her to say no, though, was the fact that she was now a full-fledged member of the Paladin Order. It was a reveal that was made rather nonchalantly in the movie, but here in the novel it was backed by a motivation strong enough to decline an offer from the person she admired most. She would then say the lines we saw in the movie, leading Ainz to freeze up almost like a statue. He was clearly affected by the news Neia just handed to him. We didn't get to see it ourselves, but the news of Neia's frontline position would leave Ainz stunned. It's the reason we see him warn her of that being a very dangerous position. Obviously, this was Ainz trying to prevent her from getting killed in the massacre he knew was coming, but despite his warnings, Neia resolved herself to fight anyway. Her skills as an archer were far too valuable to not use up there on the wall. So, in an effort to help her, Ainz would give her the items we saw in the movie, the first of which was Buzz's magic armor, an item which conformed itself to fit the user. Armor like this bore quite the interesting trait, since you could very well make it to be the size of a ring, then later have it fit someone who was a giant. The only issue with that is that the durability of the armor depended on the amount and quality of materials used. So, while yes, you could make a small magic piece of armor that fit everyone, the enchantment on it wouldn't be anywhere near as effective as a regular-sized piece of magic armor. It would easily succumb to gear-breaking abilities. This, however, didn't apply to Buzz's armor, since its base size was far larger than Neia herself. As for the item Ainz would give her next, this was the Crown of Psychic Defense, a wearable that protected the user from attacks with attributes such as Charm and Fear. It was extremely effective in nullifying incoming magic, but didn't do much against special abilities. The thing about nullifying all types of magic, though, is that it didn't matter whether it was positive or negative. A targeted buff would be dispelled the same way a debuff would. Next were the Archer's Gauntlets, equipment Ainz had made himself because some of his spells required shooting skills. It was after he stopped using that type of magic, though, that this particular piece of equipment just sat in his storage. Finally was a necklace that consumed mana in exchange for casting a tier 3 faith magic healing spell. So long as the wearer had mana to spare, then the spell Heavy Recovery could be cast as many times as needed. It just cost more than what it usually would had it been cast regularly. So, for Neia and her meager supply of mana, that meant she could really only cast it once. Now, this particular piece wasn't one Ainz had made because he found it useful, it was instead bought because apparently he found it attractive. So, it's interesting to see how Ainz approached what I assume is low-level gear from Yggdrasil. Neia, of course, didn't know that, so to her she thought all this was extremely valuable. She felt that if she brought them to the battlefield, then the risk of turning them over to the enemy was far worse than any benefit she could provide while wearing them. She also couldn't fathom taking further advantage of Ainz's kindness. It was after Neia explained that to Ainz that that's when he would state the condition we saw in the movie. Neia would have to return the equipment to him personally. And if it did turn out her body was lost in the battlefield, then Ainz mentioned how he could simply locate his items with a spell that tracks them. So, in a single sentence, Ainz had dissuaded any concerns Neia had with all this. There was no reason anymore for her not to accept his gift. The way Ainz spoke also comforted her greatly, as despite no expressions ever being visible, his tone made it clear if he could smile, that's what he'd be doing. That's just how gently he was speaking to her here. So, to hear Ainz essentially tell her to come back alive was all it took to make Neia burst into tears. There weren't very many people aside from her parents who were ever this kind to her. That's where the scene in the movie would end, but in the novel she would actually take the time to equip the items Ainz had given her. Donning the necklace immediately bestowed upon her the knowledge on how to use the item's ability, making it feel as if it was an extension of her own body. Wearing the crown didn't make her feel any different, but given what it was said to do, she figured something had to trigger it first. Then, lastly, the gauntlets triggered a boost in strength unlike any she'd ever felt before. Just like how power buffs made her feel stronger, with these gauntlets, Neia felt like her movements were sharper and faster. It was as if every physical aspect of her body just got enhanced, much to the point that she felt like a completely different person now. So, it was in this moment that Neia started to see just how amazing magic was, a sentiment Ainz couldn't help but agree with. For him though, it was the daily applications of magic that impressed him. To be able to produce spices, ores, and even a city supply's worth of water with it, it was clear magic could play a huge role in the development of the New World's culture. That for Neia was everyday life though, so she didn't understand why a caster as great as Ainz was surprised by it. She'd never really had to think of how arduous life would be without magic making things easier. It was after that Ainz would segue into the more interesting facets of society, but rather than get into how interesting it was that slimes coexisted with humans by residing in the sewers, he instead spared Neia and sent her off to do her new job, a lookout on the town's west wall. Ainz would first leave her with one last bit of advice, and that was if things looked rough, she should run to the east gate. That was the only place he knew she'd be able to survive. Knowledge Ainz was the only one privy to. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. I wouldn't say the stuff with the demi-humans was particularly important, but I find Ainz's conversation with Neia here so much more impactful. It's interesting that Ainz would go about trying to save her his own way, despite having every opportunity to just by telling Demiurge. If anything, it shows he actually cares for her. So, I hope you found this extra cut content interesting, and if you want to see more then be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Until next time though, ciao.